program between Sumas Library, Washington County Library District, and the Senior Center. And we'd like to welcome Steve Jordan to talk about the history of the local history and his family's involvement with the development of our community.
Good evening. First off, I'd like to say that I'd like to do another one of these on the geology of the region and how it came to be. If anybody's ever not had the chance to check out my map that I made for my final, it's rather telling of the history of the area and how things came to be. So, we're going to be talking about railroads and how railroads changed the region and how they came to be. What brought the railroads here? What were the benefits of the railroads for here? I'm going to start out with my great-great-grandfather. Came to this region in 1871. I'm going to talk about some of the other people that he was involved with, but how it brought the railroads here. What was the interest? My great-great-grandfather was born in New York City, or New York, upside of New York City. He was in the Civil War. A couple of people that he was in the Civil War with were some of the reasons that he was involved later on with the railroads here. He later made Anacortes his home, even though he was quite involved from the Canadian border all the way down through what is now Skagit County. At that time, this was the territory of Washington. It had just become a territory separated from Oregon territories. And the push was to come west because the GLO, Government Land Office, had just made land available cheap so that they could use that money to pay our debts to the French for helping us in the Revolutionary War. So in that, they surveyed from the Ohio's west, and as fast as they could break it up, they would sell it. One of the key players in all this is the very first territorial governor of the state of Washington. Isaac Stevens was a colonel in the Army prior to the Civil War, had got out, was a very well-known surveyor, and was one of 10 men that were given areas to survey for the railroads to come west. And he was given the furthest north from Minnesota to the Pacific, and to survey the routes west. As soon as he got done surveying to the west, he ended up staying here. He got commissioned once he was here to be the first territorial governor once Washington had become a territory in 1854. I guess it was 1857 by that time. Started the survey in 1854, coming west. He was the territorial governor for about 3 years, and then went back east. About that time, this little conflict called the Civil War broke out. And he was recommissioned in the Army for the North as a brigadier general. He was underneath Sherman's command, and his son, which also played a big part of Washington's history, was underneath his command, and so was my great-grandfather. During this time of the Civil War, which he died in, there was 2 years of which my great-grandfather and his son, which were best friends at that time, I kept hearing stories of how much he loved the area of Anacortes, Skagit Valley, and this valley, which wasn't called Whatcom Valley at that time, but up to the Canadian border. It had such a meaning to them that once the Civil War was over, they came out here they took, the railroad was through the southern route. They came through, got on boats to San Francisco and came up here and landed in LaConner in 1871. He was interested, he worked for farmers in the southern Skagit area at first. And this was known as the breadbasket of the West Coast. So he instantly had a job as working for a farmer. But in his spare time, him and one of his good friends that he had back in Minnesota before he came out here was later called Amos Pegleg Everett because of an accident that occurred when they were out prospecting for gold on the Skagit River. And a rock ran over, crushed his buddy's leg, and two guys ended up carrying him out and got him on a steamboat to Seattle, where he ended up having his leg amputated and then had a peg leg. So that was his nickname, was Peg Leg Everett. So getting back to this gentleman for just a moment, it was Abraham Lincoln that wanted the northern route put through first. So with stories told from Mr. Stevens, they put the crowning glory of the U.S. Navy and parked it out and called the bay off of Anacortes Ship Harbor, and parked SS Massachusetts off the coast because it was the deep water. It was a four-master, stood out very prominently. After that time, the Interstate Commerce Commission came into being, and they were employing money and land rights to the railroads to bring out and get a terminus, is what they called the area or the town that would be where the railroad would terminate at the Pacific. Okay, so the race was on to host the terminus of the railroad. Anacortes and this region here were courting, and it was who could get through the passes first. So there were investors throwing money at surveyors to get through the Cascades. And if we would have been able to get through the Cascades at Stevens Pass before they did at Snoqualmie Pass, this would have been the big metropolis, not Tacoma and Seattle area. Because another gentleman named Stevens, John F. Stevens, was a prominent surveyor, was able to get the route through to put the railroad through Stevens Pass. Thus it was called Stevens Pass after him. But just a little late of when they got it through Snoqualmie Pass, and then that's where they said, okay, that's where it's going to be. The terminus is going to be Tacoma. Anyway, with John F. Stevens, just a side note, to say how prominent of a surveyor he was, handpicked by Isaac Stevens. He was, after he did the route through Stevens Pass, he went down to Panama and bailed out the French and finished and successfully surveying the Panama Canal, where he died of some kind of fever, like a lot of other people did. So he died in the Civil War. His son and my great-great-grandfather hear all these stories about this. They come out here, and it's true. It's everything he said it was. They spent a year out here trying to get everything together. My great-great-grandfather goes back to Minnesota, sells the farm to his dad, which doubled his dad's size of his farm. His wife, 3 kids. He had 4 kids, but the other one was born out here. His friend's family, because he swore he'd take care of his friend that was injured in the Civil War and eventually died and succumbed of his injuries, but not until they were out here. The Sharp family. If anybody goes out to Whidbey Island, they hear Sharp's Corner. That's them. And then Sharp's State Park, that was their homestead where they gave, they donated the land to the State Park Service. Brought the whole caboodle out here and set up shop. And he kept on prospecting in his spare time, where him and Pegleg and another gentleman named Stevens, Lafayette Stevens, were up prospecting on the opposite side of the Skagit River from Hamilton.
Okay.
He was, my great-great-grandfather knew a lot about dealing with being friendly to Indians and having them, you wash my back, I wash yours type thing, from being back in Minnesota and whatever. So he came out here and he used that to his advantage, and always talked with him about, well, where's this and how's that? And they were talking about this black metal on the other side of the river. So he crossed the river, and lo and behold, halfway up the mountain, which is now called Coal Mountain, struck the largest coal deposit north of Seattle. So that wasn't what he was after. So he sold his shares to Pegleg and Lafayette Stevens and went further up the river. And about that time, he got up to a certain area, and all he found was lime. He didn't want lime. That's not what he was after. So again, he sold his shares, and he bought a lot of land out on Valdago Island is what it was called at the time, where this gentleman here had already bought a third of it, thinking that he would return. So my great-grandfather bought a bunch, and then he bought some from the GLO and put it in his son's name, which is now a park. That one that caught on fire last summer, he had the forest fire in Anacortes, that was that park. So anyhow, Lafayette, Hazard Stevens, Isaac Stevens' son, comes out here after he finished law school after the Civil War. He was already a surveyor. Got a theme going here. So he became a lawyer for the Attorney General's office. He was assistant to the very first Attorney General of Washington State when it became an office of the government here. In those dealings, he got in good with J.J. Hill, which was a huge player in Northern Pacific Railroad. He bought up anything and everything. There were quite a few, they didn't call them depressions back then, they just called them recessions, where there were highs and lows, and he'd buy up all these fledgling little railroads and add them to his fleet. And then he was buying up the north and south route. In doing that, Hazard Stevens, he liked to climb Mount Rainier a lot for some reason. But he became a lawyer for the Northern Pacific Railroad. And they were trying to put through the routes to Canada before Canada, the Canadian railroads, came around south. Which for the most part, they're pretty well successful. There was a couple of railroads from Canada that made it down to Blaine and whatever first. So, trying to collect my thoughts here. No notes. So, that's his son Hazard Stevens when he became a lawyer and became one of the head employees and part owner in the Northern Pacific Railroad. This is an early route of all the whistle stops along the way from Minnesota to Sumas to Moclips, of all places, and Raymond were the end points. So, for this region, one of the very first railroads that were not a metropolis paid for by big money, this was all little players, was Bellingham and British Columbia Railroad. That's what it's called. It was never ended up running underneath that. It was organized in 1883 to go to Mission, but it got hung up in the way in the meantime. This is where my great-great-grandfather comes in. My great-great-grandfather was a surveyor too. As I went to school for it, let's put it that way. I don't call myself surveyor. Hazard Stevens asked him, would you go and assist them in putting the railroad through? Because they had a lot of troubles. Major trouble, especially from like Acme north, where they came off the F&S, which was between Cedro and Woolley, which is now Cedro-Woolley, because there was two different, you can hear mine.
Yeah, it was two different towns.
So anyhow, the F&S went to Fairhaven. Well, they broke off with this railroad to come to Sumas. Later on, went up to Glacier to haul logs. There were eventually 11 railroads in Sumas.
Oh, wow.
And 2 round tables. One where the Starving Sam's is, that was originally a round table. If anybody wants to know more about that, ask Ernie Snyder. He loves talking about that round table. I never saw it. I'm not old enough to remember. I wasn't around. And if anybody really wants to know about the later times of railroads in Sumas, you need to ask Lauren Coleman, because he actually worked the railroad here. Well, I just know about the earlier stuff because studying about my family and the great records that the Secretary of State's office has is phenomenal. If anybody just can't find records, go to the Secretary of State's office. They got everything. So, again, the way maps were made back then, the early, so this was high tech. The very early routes, this was done in a navigational style, because in the early railroads, railroads were under navigational rule. Like you have the Department of Transportation now, and they recognize each different kind. They didn't back then. You ran your railroad the same way the Navy did, or sailing ships. This is how railroads were put through, from Ohio to here, one shovel at a time. This is one of the reasons why they had a hard time getting a railroad here. That would be now Everson. At that time, it was river crossing. They had finally gotten the bridge through in Deming, the old log piling, before it got wiped out by a log jam. The Sharp brothers became one of the very first road construction companies in this area, and it was in Whatcom County. Whatcom County back then went from the Canadian border all the way down to King County. Okay? Then it became, they broke it off and made Skagit County, and then later on Snohomish County. Everett was known as Snohomish, and this was one of the biggest towns, and Fairhaven was one of the biggest towns north of Seattle. So, my great-grandfather employed the Sharp brothers, which built the Farm to Market Road, like going from Highway 20, the road going from Anacortes across the Spit, that was built by the Sharp brothers, all the way to Burlington. Those were just get your product to the railroads, because at that time the railroad went through Burlington. You had to get your product to the railroad. Okay. Before that, they had used boats to get it around. So they finally got across river crossing, and going up through Van Buren and Clearbrook, going to Clearbrook, Canada, and bearing left to Vancouver, which never happened. That was, and I had a journal. I wish I can't find it. I wish I was able to find it, where my great-grandfather put in his journals that was his only default, was not being able to get from Clearbrook to Clearbrook, because it kept sinking railroad ties and ballast between Clearbrook and the border. So they could never get enough ballast in there. They just kept sinking ballast and ballast and ballast. About this time, they were really pushing a lot of money from the government to the railroads, because they were trying to get the telegraph line all the way through to Russia. So they would have the telegraph line go all the way around. So they were trying to get to where they could get the cables up to the Bering Sea to lay across the Bering Straits. That's one of the reasons why they were really hot and heavy on getting these railroads. And about that time, a depression hit in 1891. So it really put a crimp in everything. So this is one of the terminals that my great-grandfather was brought here to supervise building. There were 3 of them. You worked in one of them, I'm sure, before it was tore down. Sumas, the terminal over here.
Yeah.
So this was some of the Chinese workers that were brought in by the government to get the railroad done so that they could get those telegraph wires up through. That's why it's called Telegraph Road and whatever. This is the very first telegraph office here in Sumas. It's called the BC Electric Depot. This was as far as that telegraph got for the turn of the century. Looking down the row of, now I never got to see these with my own eye because they were tore down in what, the 70s? Something like that?
Late 70s or early 80s.
And so this is why my great-grandfather was brought here in the Depression, so he had work during that time. But he had bought land from the farmers and whatever to put the easements through to get here. So I can sit here and look at all these railroad lines here and go, you know, he walked these same lands to do that. So I'm not sure, Lauren, is that your Dodge sitting there?
Yeah, probably.
Before it got tore down, I'm sure that's Lauren's ride there.
Where were these buildings at? Excuse me.
Sumas. You worked in that one right there, I'm sure.
Across from the customs.
That would be going into Canada. So anyway, yeah, I stole this one from Debbie, but it's such a good illustration of the way all the different maze of railroads went around and how they all, and not all of them are on here because it doesn't show some of the little bitty logging railroads and whatever that were brought in here. But anyway, that there was a maze of them, and then, of course, everybody knows at about 1890 something, they had the gold strikes, and everybody came here, unloaded off the trains, got wagoned over to Mission, put on steamships, and sent up to Alaska. There were so many, and it's something a lot of people don't know about, are the steamboats, like people see them, the paddle boats, the big stern rollers, going up and down the rivers. They got taken apart, disassembled, and men packed them by hand over the hills of up to Alaska, and they reassembled them in Alaska, about 7 of them altogether, so that they could, that was their transportation across the big long lakes and up and down the rivers once they got up there. They were brought here by train, unloaded, and it was by hand all the way to Alaska. So, anyway, that was 4th of July, 1890 in Anacortes. The guy that bought Hazard or Isaac Stevens' land, since he died, it was in his estate. he came out west with the Curtis family's fortune and bought all that land, and knowing that it was going to be the terminus, which it never became. Bought it and named it after his wife, Anna Kurtz. Then it became a depression and all went downhill real quick. He came to Sumas with my great-grandfather and surveyed across into Canada. And he'd come back on the weekends. Anna Curtis fell in love with Sumas and ended up staying here, and she didn't want to go back to the city that was named after her. She ended up staying here until she left in like 1920, this was like one of the biggest celebrations that they had at the time, because they were celebrating that they were going to get the terminus.
Who was he married?
In California. She went to California. She left here to go to California to take care of her son and his buddy that got in an accident and ended up dying of some kind of fever or something that they had down there, and never did make it back. So anyhow, that's it. That's the caboose. So this was the train on the very front, I forgot to mention, was the Seattle, Lakeside, and Eastern, owned by the Eastern Company Corporation. This was the caboose leaving on its maiden journey. It later became the Seattle, Lakeside, and Sumas, just before it was bought by the Northern Pacific Railroad. So it had a short-lived title because it was becoming defunct, and of course, who bought all the defunct railroads? The Northern Pacific Railroad. So anyway, that's all I got. If anybody had any questions.
Why did they want to send a telegraph to Russia?
They wanted to send it all the way around the world.
Oh.
They wanted to be connected all the way around the world, and that's the only thing that was keeping them from doing it was the Bering Straits. And of course, now there's old railroad locomotives up there on the prairies of Alaska, half submerged in the permafrost because they sunk them in the peat moss would hold it, the weight of it in the wintertime, but when it got warm and thawed out, it would just sink in that peat moss. So, yeah.
I'm looking for the Holy Grail. Have you ever seen the picture of the roundhouse in Sumas?
Once, and I wanted to get it for this, and I can't find it. I've got it on a flash drive or something somewhere. There was a couple of them.
If you can find the picture.
It's the small one. There was the big one and the small one.
Yes, I know.
And the big one, Ernie was telling me it was where the Starving Sam's is. I call it Stop and Rob.
The big one was what?
Starving Sam's is.
Oh.
The other one was further north as far as what I've been told. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Out of curiosity, my wife and I moved from Linden out here to Sumas, just over here on Swartwood Road about 8 years ago. And the survey that had already been done a few years before that, we got a copy of that from the county, and it showed a railroad line that had gone through that way. And our neighbors there on the road told there's still sort of a hump in the road.
Yep.
They said that's where the railroad was.
You betcha.
And on the survey, on one of your previous slides, when it showed the names of all of the railroads in the area, it was the real long one, St. Paul and Pacific and Milwaukee or something. So where did that go? Did it head out to Canada?
It went to Canada at about a 45-degree angle out past, trying to remember where Al's house, where he was born. and went around, it made a bend and went around and went up the hill and connected with the Minnesota, something in Minnesota line. And then there was a Milwaukee that came down the hill from north, like the North Pass Road where the Cedar Springs is. That was the Minnesota or Milwaukee line.
So what would those trains like those spurs, say that one running out into Canada, was it hauling logs, lumber, people primarily, or?
That one was probably hauling freight.
Oh,
Yeah, that would go to up into the Hope area.
Wow.
And then there was also, and most people don't know it, is the electric lines. We had a lot of electric railroads in this area. On the other side of that hill, there's Kurtz Lake. You can't see it from here. Just around the bend, there is a. If you ever want to see this in person, you can ask Debbie. She's got a copy of it. That map right there, if you look up in the left, the upper left corner, that was a power station that was built in the early 1890s that was fed by water from the Kurtz Lake and powered it. And the electric railroad actually went across the lake. Right there, you see that this is lake. It went across the lake to Sumas.
Wow.
Okay, and this was after they drained the lake. This was Sumas Lake, and they drained it, and that became all the fertile soil. They came all the way down into here, and this was all then sand dunes, because when this, in the summertime, the water would recede and you get the northeaster winds, and it would blow lake bottom. So this was all shallow in over here, but it would blow sand dunes. So there's sand dunes out on a rock road. And, the interesting thing about Sumas Lake, it came to be by, this was all Puget Sound at one time. And this was actually where what is now known as the Fraser River came down through, right down through Sumas. And 5,000 years ago, which is in geologic years, rather young, outside of town, there was an uplift, 16 feet. And that dammed off the river, backed it up and made Sumas Lake. Then the river had to find another route, so it went around the other side of what is now Sumas Mountain in Canada, and then made that delta area. So all this delta area was made by the Fraser River deposits over the eons. But that changed, and that's still being made, delta and all that area out there, it's still being deposited, because that's now where that goes. What we know as the Fraser River now, because it didn't have a name back then, it actually was deposited out by what is Bellingham. And the Nooksack was a tributary to it.
Are those the two mountains on either side of the
You have Sumas Mountain and you have Vedder.
Oh,
which
that's
is-
the better?
And that's that mountain over there, that mountain range there, the Vedder, and then that's Sumas Mountain right there. I mean,
Where on the map, can you show me where is Better Mountain and where is Sumas Mountain on your map?
okay, there's two Sumas Mountains.
Yeah,
There's American Sumas Mountain,
I know,
and there out that window you'll look and you'll see
that's the one.
Canadian Sumas Mountain. And then that's the Vedder Range, and that's where the railroad followed and went up to,
So where's Sumas Mountain on our side? Oh, right, oh, okay, okay.
It's one with big antennas over
Yeah,
here.
I know where it is.
So anyway, this is Kurtz Lake. And this is Columbia Valley, over here. So, yeah, Reese Hill. So it went all the way up into where you went up to Reese Hill. Yeah, one time when it was the highest water. And, so that's it in a nutshell. There used to be quite a few variety of crops growing here: hops, tobacco, sugar beets. Some of the other ones that people don't really know about, that don't really think of this as being tobacco growing region. Oh, tea. Yeah, but this was a huge hops growing area before it was dairy.
When did the dairy farmers first start coming in?
Well, after the lake was drained, it was finished being drained in 1929. So that's when they really started bringing in a lot of dairy into this area. The other thing is, there used to be quite a few boats on Sumas Lake. It had 2 ferries. And it came right up to the intersection, basically the intersection of Telegraph and Holville Road, where that's all kind of filled in now. But I was quite surprised that they were able to get a steamboat up that far, up Sumas. I'm sure it's silted in considerably since then. But, and then the Kurtz family that stayed here, Debbie has, if you ever have looked at her blog, you'll see a bunch of pictures of the Kurtz family and their, I can't remember the name of their boat, but they got a lot of pictures of their boat on Sumas Lake. And there's also the ones of them coming up Sumas River. And you can tell there's a big difference between Sumas River then and Sumas River now. They had taken their mast out on going underneath the bridge across the Sumas River. I'm guessing Front Street. But if anybody has any questions about surveying stuff or how land was done around here, you can let me know. I have a whole lot of information on the old GLO, which is Government Land Survey Office, who bought what, where, how. You know, they get records. When I went to school, I had a license to where I could go and get the kind of information that you have to send away for and just hope they give you, and I was able to do it online. So, any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The Sumas Mountain on the Canadian side.
Yep.
Up there, is that what we see where all the houses are going on and the lights, or would that be?
That's this end of it, yeah.
Okay.
The other end of it, they have a moratorium on it because very few people know about this. This whole side is slumping. And that's why they have a moratorium on building there. And they also have a moratorium on taking gravel out. Well, now they went, oh, moratorium's off. We need to get the gravel out of there. The lighter we make it, the less we'll have a problem of it. But this became a big deal once we had the Oso landslide. Because then the geologists went, oh, wait a minute. That's nothing. The size of this one that's a mile. This is 5 miles.
Wow.
If this lets go, it'll block off the Fraser River. Guess where the Fraser River has to go then? Right where it used to go. So, and it's also a little slide right here, little slide area. But the only thing that's really gonna affect is that little freeway over there that they got, the only one they got in the whole world. Is it one? Okay, but it's about the size of Oso, about a mile long. But it's on this side. But this one over here, 5 miles of this is so unstable, and it's all where they got the quarries and stuff at. They can't make up their mind if they're stop quarrying. Let's quarry like we're, you know, never quarried before. Let's get it out of there. It's the less that's going to slide if it does. So. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned something about the railroad going up by Silver Springs
Yep.
or Cedar Springs.
Cedar Springs.
Okay, well, the railroad used to go on up Reese Hill
Yeah, that was a different one.
and went towards Kendall, but it went up to the lime quarry
Yep.
and hauled all the stuff out of the lime quarry down.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, for years, well then, they decided that using trucks was better.
Yeah, I was referring though to the one he was talking about.
I see.
Yeah, yeah, that's the one that everybody knows about because it's got everybody's backyard has easement to it. It crosses at some point. And then Sour Creek follows it on down the hill. Whoever Sour Creek was named after. Oh, hi, Alan.
Alan's ancestors.
Yep. So anyhow,
Do you know anything about that road? You get around Sumas Lake, you get up in this Hill Lake area? Sportsman wagon?
there were 2 stagecoaches, but the one that I know about went up Reese Hill. That's where Reese Hill was, the road was taken. Went up through Columbia Valley, through Kurtz Lake area, and up through.
No.
And that's the one that
This
I know
one-
about.
this
There was
one-
another one that I don't know the particulars about.
Well, the
that was
other-
said to
the
go
other
along
one-
here.
It's still there, but it's in awful bad shape. But when I was a kid, you could still drive on it.
But that's the one that goes
That's
along
the
where
one that you just follow the
road?
edge of the lake up. You go right along the foot of the mountain.
Yeah, I don't
along
have
the
any
lake.
particulars on that one.
Right?
I don't have any particulars on that one.
Oh.
I never did find out any information about it. I did find out information about this one here though, because it was the long range. I just heard about that one recently. So anyhow, though, if anybody wants to lay their eyes on it, talk to Debbie. She's got stashed somewhere. Probably blow the dust off of it. So that's all I got. If there's no other questions.
Just out of curiosity, I know you mentioned the powerhouse up there. Whereabouts was that located?
See where that yellow dot is? Can you see the yellow dot underneath that?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Now I do.
These were pumps that were for draining the lake. And that's where the location of that is. That just got refurbished and sold for an ungodly amount of money. Some kind of millions. Some ungodly amount of money. Some mansion. But it was decrepit, ugly. Everybody thought it was haunted. But anyway, this is basically taken from the foot of that power station, looking across the lake. There were some people when I first moved here that told me when they were kids that, especially when the lake was frozen, that they could hear the train coming across the lake. Yeah, it's like, okay. Oh, but a little bit more about the electric lines. That they were called cars, not rail lines. That went from just up in Canada to here because of that power station. Went from Sumas to Bellingham, back and forth, and then eventually there was one that went from Bellingham all the way down into Arlington.
Just a question. You said when Sumas Lake froze, I was under the impression that Sumas Lake was very, very, very salty. It was a very salty. No?
It was very shallow, especially at this end. It would freeze at the drop of a hat.
Oh, but it wasn't salty. Oh,
No,
no, I just,
that's all river bottom.
so it's fresh water. Did it have a drainage in and out, or was it just?
It had drainage in the Vedder and the Sumas, well, Johnson Creek,
Oh,
Sumas
yeah. Oh.
River, and the Vedder used to flow into it. The Vedder was, see the green line up there?
Mhm.
The Vedder had the dike put across it to carry it out to the Fraser River, but it used to be fed by all those.
Right, yeah.
That's why they had to do that, because they couldn't get that other end to drain because it's the
It's higher than the Fraser,
pretty much.
yeah. Or lower than the Fraser.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It was a very interesting talk.
I'm
We
sorry about the
appreciate
music.
your time.
That's okay.
Oh, my gosh. I
We
should have
appreciate
said
your story. We appreciate your time.
Now watch it work now.
I think you have